The Avalon, a sleeper ship transporting 5,000 colonists and 258 crew members in hibernation pods, is traveling from Earth to the planet Homestead II. This is a 120-year journey as part of a mass exodus of Earth's population due to ecocide and the collapse of the biosphere. After only 30 years, suddenly, the ship passes through an asteroid belt, weakening its shields. Power is diverted to the main shield, but the ship is on a collision course with a giant asteroid. Suddenly, the asteroid collision damages the ship despite its defense systems, causing various malfunctions. The ship begins self-reparations, but one of the malfunctions awakens passenger Jim Preston, a mechanical engineer, 90 years too early. His pod opens, and an automated system helps with his awakening, telling him that he spent 120 years in suspended animation and that the ship is only 4 months away from Homestead II. He's told that he will be able to spend that time enjoying the luxurious aspects of the ship. Jim receives instructions about his ID band, his cabin, and the primary activities he's to take part in before their final arrival on the planet. Excited and nervous to meet the people on the ship, he gets ready, leaves his cabin, and walks into an automated class meant for an entire learning group. Jim looks a little anxious as the hologram explains the situation on Earth, calling it overpopulated, overpriced, and overrated. It tells him to hold his questions to the end of the lesson, but Jim keeps asking why he's the only one there. He realizes that the hologram can't answer him and goes to search for other people. He gets to the main concourse of the ship, but unfortunately, no one is there either. An automated information desk offers to help. Jim asks to talk to a real person, and it sends him off to talk to a steward. But when he finds that no one is there too, he asks to speak to the captain. When he gets to the bridge, even though he doesn't have access to go inside, he can see that none of the main crew is awake either. Jim eventually goes to the observatory, where he finds out that the ship is actually 90 years away from Homestead II, and not 4 months as he was earlier told. He realizes that he woke up too soon, so he rushes back to the concourse and sends a message back to Earth, asking what he should do because he doesn't know how to get back into hibernation. The communication system informs him that the overpriced call to Earth would take approximately 55 years to get an answer back. Jim is devastated. He walks around and finds the ship's bar, where he sees another person. As he's talking to the bartender, he notices that something is weird about him. When he goes to get him a drink, Jim realizes that he's an android. His name is Arthur. Jim wants to find out more information from Arthur, but he can't bring himself to explain how it's possible for him to be there ahead of time. Jim wakes up in his cabin the next day and goes to the cantina, where he quickly realizes that most of the things on the menu are reserved for gold-class passengers only. He gets his plain coffee and tries to figure out how to fix his hibernation chamber. After he gets all the tools, he manages to get it operating and lies down inside the pod. Unfortunately, nothing happens. Next, he decides to use the tools he found to get into the crew's hibernation chambers. That doesn't work either. Small malfunctions happen around the ship, and Jim keeps returning to the bar to drink, but mostly to talk to Arthur. Arthur convinces him to break into one of the gold classrooms and try to have some fun on the ship. Jim tries all the restaurants, the games, and the entertainment system. But as time passes, he becomes even more miserable and lonely. After a year of isolation, he gets drunk and wanders around the hibernation pods when he stumbles into an airlock with spacesuits designed for spacewalks. Jim gets into a suit and goes to the airlock, pushes a lever, and then the button to release the airlock door. He goes outside the ship and he finds the view breathtaking. Jim releases the magnets on his boots and floats in space. At this point, he's frustrated because he's all alone. He comes back inside, takes off the suit, but goes back to the airlock without it on. He pulls the lever, ready to end his life, but changes his mind at the last moment and runs back inside, slipping on a bottle. Jim stands up and is instantly drawn to a woman in one of the pods, named Aurora Lane. He searches for her files in the directory, sees her video profile, and is smitten. Later, he sits next to her pod, still listening to her interviews. Back in the bar, he's reading some of her work as he talks to Arthur. He talks about the irony of his situation, going to another planet for a better life, waking up early and not getting there, and finding his perfect woman, only for her to be out of reach. The more he thinks about her, the more he starts convincing himself to wake Aurora up. He tries to explain his reasons to Arthur, but Arthur doesn't get it. He considers reviving her for companionship, but struggles to do so, knowing it is morally wrong, and he'll be trapping her there with him, to die on the ship. Jim decides not to wake Aurora up at first, but as time goes by, he becomes obsessed with the idea. He goes to her pod and manages to activate it. He eventually awakens her. As she's waking up, Jim hides and goes back to his room. A little bit later, he goes to the main concourse, hoping to find her. He finds her there, as confused as he was a year ago. Jim tells her they're the only ones awake, and lets her believe that she's also awake because her pod malfunctioned. He takes her to the observatory and tells her that he can't get to either the crew or the main commands of the ship. Aurora freaks out and wants to get back into her pod. When they get to it, Jim explains that there is no special equipment on the ship that can help them get back into hibernation, effectively telling her that they're stranded. They go back to the concourse, and he tells her that she should rest since she just came out of hibernation. She feels sorry for him, having to spend more than a year alone on the ship. Jim goes back to the bar, feeling regretful about what he did. He asks Arthur not to tell Aurora that he was the one that woke her up. The next day, Aurora wakes up. She goes back to the concourse and asks the automated info desk about the hibernation pods. Jim joins her there and they go to get breakfast. As they leave, the info desk has some sort of malfunction. In the cantina, Aurora realizes that Jim has been eating the same breakfast for more than a year and gets him one of the gold-class menus. They talk about the possibility of fixing the pods, but unlike Jim, Aurora isn't ready to give up. She searches through the infirmary, then goes through research documents, eventually ending up at the crew's hibernation quarters, trying to break the doors open. Jim notices more malfunctions throughout the ship. Sometime later, Aurora laments about her life on the Avalon. She writes, jogs around the ship, and swims in the pool. Now she is aware that she is really stranded. She goes to the cantina to interview Jim, thinking that his story might be interesting. She asks why he immigrated to the colony. Jim answers with slogans from the company first, but then further explains that he hopes that in the new world he could be somebody, so he could build a life. Aurora also shares her reason for being there. Unlike the other passengers on the ship, she has a round-trip ticket. Her idea was to go to Homestead II, live there for a year, and come back to Earth to become the first journalist that has ever done that, writing the greatest story that ever was. Aurora slowly gives up on finding a way to fix their current predicament, and Jim figures out a way to cheer her up. He takes her dancing, to the cinema, and to the basketball court. Lastly, he takes her to the bar to meet Arthur. She relaxes for a bit, but when she remembers her situation, she feels sad again and walks away. Jim is left alone with the android, feeling awful about what he's done to her. Wanting to cheer her up, Jim makes Aurora a miniature of the Chrysler Building. Aurora is touched. Later, they go on a date at the bar. They have dinner and share stories about their lives. She tells him that her father died when she was a teenager. After the dinner, Jim takes Aurora to the airlock, and they get into the spacesuits. They go out for a spacewalk together. Jim switches off the magnets on their boots, and they float together in space. They come back inside and immediately kiss, retreat to his cabin, and sleep together. Soon after, they start living like a couple. Aurora moves into his cabin and writes about her life on the ship. They jog together, eat together, and sleep together. Jim explores the ship further and finds the hydroponics bay. He brings Aurora flowers. One day the ship passes by a red giant, and they go to the observatory to see it. It's Aurora's birthday, so later that night they celebrate in one of the many restaurants on the ship, and then the bar. Jim goes to the washroom and prepares the ring he made for Aurora, while she stays in the bar chatting with Arthur. Arthur inadvertently reveals the truth about her awakening, after Aurora tells him that she and Jim do not keep secrets from one another. He tells her that Jim woke her up intentionally, unaware that he was still supposed to keep that a secret. When Jim comes back, a distraught and enraged Aurora confronts him. She runs away furious and disgusted. Jim comes back to his cabin to find all her things gone. He runs into her in the cantina the next day, but the moment he speaks, she walks away. Aurora is heartbroken. One night she goes over to Jim's cabin, punching and kicking him, wanting to kill him. Jim talks to her over the comm because she keeps avoiding him. He tries to apologize and explain his actions to her. He tells her he fell in love with her, but Aurora doesn't care. She can't forgive him for taking her life away. One night, as Jim is in his cabin, another malfunction happens. The ship faces a critical error, and the main command shuts down. Later, he walks into the elevator and it malfunctions. Aurora walks into the main concourse and sees that Jim has planted a tree there. Then, she goes to the cantina, where the food dispensary is also malfunctioning. This malfunction causes another pod failure that awakens Gus Mancuso, a deck chief officer. Suddenly, both of them hear the voice of Gus over the comms, asking who planted the tree. They both run into the concourse and see Gus Mancuso standing in front of Jim's tree. They introduce themselves and tell the chief about the situation. He doesn't understand how 3 pods could fail. Using Gus's personnel code, the group accesses the ship's bridge. They discover multiple cascading failures throughout the ship's systems, but the computer does not reveal the cause. If left unrepaired, the ship will inevitably fail, causing the passengers and crew to perish. When they leave the bridge, a robot almost falls on their heads, and the two of them tell Mancuso that malfunctions have been happening all over the ship more frequently. He says that shouldn't happen, as he shows them how to collect the data. Mancuso checks on the pods, and Jim joins him. He's figured out what happened with Aurora's pod. Gus realizes that Jim awakened Aurora, and he does not condone Jim's actions. Later, he's at the bridge checking the collected data when Aurora joins him. They talk about what happened with her pod. He tells Aurora that a drowning man will grab onto any lifeline. Unfortunately, there's nothing he can do about it. Jim walks in with the 16th broken robot. Mancuso feels the hibernation sickness, so he goes to rest, but as he walks out, he coughs out blood. That night, Aurora can't sleep, so she goes for a swim. Suddenly, there's gravity loss throughout the ship, and she starts drowning as the water from the pool moves with her. The gravity drive resets, and she barely makes it out alive. Jim and Aurora run into each other going to find Mancuso. The 3 of them are back at the bridge. Mancuso figures out that something happened 2 years ago, taking out a major system. They need to find and fix what has caused the failure, because the entire ship is trying to pick up the slack. If they don't fix it, the entire vessel will be stranded. They go to find the problem, but Mancuso faints, so Jim and Aurora take him to the infirmary. He's dying, and there are no treatments that can stop it or prolong the time he has left. Sometime later, the 3 of them meet in the observatory, and Mancuso gives Jim his ID badge, an employee code to access crew-only areas, so he and Aurora can try to repair the ship. He immediately passes away. Suddenly, the lights change to an alarming red, and the ship starts shaking. Jim tells Aurora that he needs her help, and they run toward engineering, but there's another failure in the gravity drive. Another system failure occurs, and this one affects Arthur, so Jim deactivates him. They finally arrive in engineering and start looking for the problem. Jim and Aurora find hull breaches from the asteroid collision 2 years earlier. The computer module administering the ship's fusion reactor power plant has been critically damaged, causing the cascading malfunctions as the other system's computing power was diverted in an attempt to maintain it. As they open the hatch, Aurora gets sucked in. Jim gets sucked in too, but he holds onto the hatch as it keeps closing on him. Eventually, he gets sucked in too, but they quickly manage to seal the breach. Immediately after fixing that problem, Jim realizes that there is more than one breach in the hull. The 2 of them follow the trajectory of the meteor and find that it has hit the reactor control computer. Jim thinks he can find replacement parts for it. They find the part and change it, but the process of venting the reactor still fails. They do it manually, but it fails again. Jim figures out that he needs to open the vent door from outside of the ship so they can cool the reactor down. Both of them go to the airlock, and as he's getting ready to go out, he gives Aurora Mancuso's bracelet because he might not come back. She helps him with the suit, and as he walks into the airlock, she tells him to come back because she can't live on the ship without him. Aurora goes back to the reactor, where the temperature has hit critical heights. A bolt from the reactor propels into her arm, as Jim is getting closer to the vent from the outside and sees the door. The temperature rises in the reactor room, while he is trying to bypass the vent door to open it. He soon realizes that he'll have to manually hold the door open so the reactor can vent, and he tells Aurora. She doesn't like the plan, but he goes ahead with it and tells her to vent the reactor. She doesn't want him to die, and they argue, but he tells her that they have to save the other people, and she vents the reactor. The process is successful, but the fumes from the reactor push Jim away and break his tether. The pressure in his suit is dropping too. He tells Aurora what happened, and she rushes to get to another suit to bring him in. He apologizes to her again. She puts on a suit and flies out to get him, but her tether is too short. She's pulled back, but suddenly grabs onto his tether and manages to pull him in. Aurora drags Jim into the infirmary, only to find out that he's already dead. She uses Mancuso's bracelet to override the medical protocols and to resuscitate him in the autodock. The autodock automatically revives Jim. Aurora forgives him. Later, Aurora fixes Arthur, and they give Mancuso a proper space burial. Jim takes her to the infirmary and tells her that he's found a way to use the autodock as a hibernation pod for one person, and Jim insists that Aurora use it for the remainder of the voyage. Realizing she would never see Jim again, she chooses to remain awake with him. He presents her with the makeshift engagement ring he made earlier, which she accepts. The couple live out their lives on the ship. 88 years later, the ship's passengers and crew awaken on schedule, shortly before arrival at Homestead II. In the ship's grand concourse, they discover a huge tree with trailing vines, lush vegetation, flying birds, and a small cabin. A recording of Aurora's story describes the wonderful life she and Jim shared on the Avalon, while the rest of the crew were in hibernation. Thank you so much for watching. Please show your support by liking the video. It means a lot to me. Goodbye.